Mind Deconstructed, Mental Health and Wellness with Dr. Kaz and George.
The statements of Dr. Kaz and George are not a substitute for medical care, and our opinions are our own. If you are experiencing a mental health emergency, please seek assistance from a professional in your area.
You can contact us via Twitter at Mind Deconstruct. I'm your host, George. With me is Dr. Kaz. Dr. Kaz Nelson is an American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology certified psychiatrist, licensed to practice medicine in the state of Minnesota, and an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Minnesota Medical School. On today's episode, habits, obsessions, compulsions, and passions. This is episode 9 of the Mind Deconstructed. I'm George. I'm here with Dr. Kaz.
Hello.
So, Dr. Kaz, we have one quick thing to address from episode 8, and that's I made you spout out the medication names, but we didn't get those quite right.
Yeah, I caught it as soon as I was in the editing phase, but the two medications that I mentioned that have Food and Drug Administration approval for the treatment of PTSD, I made an error in one of the drugs. The two drugs that are FDA approved are sertraline and paroxetine. Those are Zoloft and Paxil by their brand names. So those are the two FDA-approved medications. The other one I mentioned, citalopram or Celexa, is commonly used in off-label purposes for the treatment of PTSD, but does not have FDA approval.
Interesting. And for our hot topic in mental health today, we have the WHO coming out with their draft classifications, and they added gaming. Is gaming a disorder now?
Well, the World Health Organization is seeing the consequences of obsessive or compulsive overuse of video games, and they want to put that on the list of their disorders.
So 2 years ago, there was a story where a couple in Japan, their infant baby died because they were playing some sort of Second Life game that somehow became more important to them than taking care of their baby. Is that an isolated incident? Is that a worldwide epidemic? What's going on?
Well, that's obviously an extreme and heartbreaking example of behavior that seems to have gone awry. When you're faced with these types of rewarding or reinforcing activities, if you're not careful, they do have potential to kind of take over your life.
And how much sway does the World Health Organization have over the United States psychiatric community?
That is a really interesting question because there is this tension globally. You have the World Health Organization, and you also have the individual organizations across different countries. In our country, the dominant organization is the American Psychiatric Association that publishes the DSM-5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that I've referenced before. So just because something's classified as a disorder by the World Health Organization doesn't necessarily mean it's classified as a mental illness by the DSM, which is what most American psychiatrists use, and also people in other parts of the world. So sometimes it's a little bit of a tension, but I think these organizations are just basically working together to understand how to take good care of people and to have meaningful health outcomes.
Do you think the American Psychiatric Association is going to jump on the bandwagon with this gaming disorder?
Well, they are continually offering revisions to the DSM, and I know they look to the World Health Organization just to see what they're doing and what type of evidence they use in making those determinations. So it's possible, but in general, they haven't been too excited to classify any of these behavioral things as mental disorders.
Okay, well, that brings us to what we are going to talk today about: habits, obsessions, compulsions, and passions. Starting with habits, every day when I get home, I put my keys in my wallet in the same spot. That's a habit.
Yeah, and it's a healthy habit, assuming that it enhances your functioning because you know where your wallet and keys are, and it causes you to lose them less often.
Certainly I could have some unhealthy habits too. Mm-hmm. None are coming to mind.
I'm sure you don't have any, George.
No, obsessions and compulsions, that has kind of a stronger ring to it.
Right.
So I can have an obsession if I like Star Wars movies. When does my obsession turn into a compulsion, or how far is too far? When does the psychiatric community start to take notice of what I'm doing?
Sure. So let's just define the terms a little bit, because there is such thing as an interest or a passion. You can have a passion for Star Wars. You can be driven to collect Star Wars memorabilia, get advance tickets to the movies, stay up late and watch a movie, those kinds of things. And in general, those are pleasurable activities, maybe promote even social bonding if you're doing these with other people with similar interests, and can actually build a community that can all be really healthy. Where it gets to the level of what we would call an obsession, which does have this kind of unhealthy ring to it. And I know we use that term casually, like I'd say, I'm obsessed with this new kind of snack that came out or something like that. But something's not really an obsession unless it's intrusive or unwanted or taking over in a way that feels out of control. So an example might be somebody who becomes obsessed with the idea that they could get ill if they touch a doorknob. And every time they see a doorknob, they feel terror, or every time they even think of a doorknob, they think, gosh, I better go wash my hands right now.
The disorder that I think of when we talk about obsessions and compulsions is obsessive compulsive disorder.
Right.
Is that a pretty extreme thing? What is that?
Yes, it's very serious. People will just be sitting there, and out of the blue, thoughts will go into their mind, whether they want them to or not. Strong thoughts, sometimes scary or upsetting thoughts. And that drives them to engage in different behaviors or compulsions in order to reduce the stress related with the obsession. So my example I used, maybe they would use hand washing to reduce that tension or anxiety related to the thought of germs or getting sick. And there's many, many, many examples. Somebody might worry that they hit somebody while they were driving, and so they might drive around the block 10 times checking, did I run over somebody? Is there a body there? Is there an emergency response? And this is unwanted, it's not controllable, and it's very, very aversive. And most of the time people know that it's not healthy or that there's something wrong. There's tends to be insight. They say, well, I know I'm not going to get sick, but I just can't help washing my hands because I feel better and I can't stop worrying about it.
There was this trend for a while where everyone say, oh, I'm OCD because I really like my books stacked a certain way or things like that. That's obviously probably not a diagnosable condition in many of those people's cases, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's a really casual use of that terminology. There is something called obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which is a problematic pattern of kind of needing things the way they are, or else you get really irritable or uncomfortable, and sometimes that impairs people's functioning in different ways and is a little bit different than obsessive compulsive disorder. But I would say being particular about things or liking things a certain way or needing your desk organized a certain way maybe just reflects some of your personality traits or the way you prefer things versus maybe being a disorder. Unless it really gets in the way of your functioning, like you can't leave your office because you're got out the ruler and you're measuring, the space between objects on your desk, and so you miss that important meeting with the boss, then you might be dealing with an OCD or a true disorder.
What about the other things that people commonly consider compulsive behaviors like gambling, the World Health Organization, video gaming, drug use, certain sexual behaviors? What about those quote unquote compulsions?
Yes, there's a whole group of behaviors that are associated with pleasure. Examples like you mentioned being eating or winning a jackpot or sexual behavior, other things like that, where our field and community is a little bit divided. Is this a mental disorder, or is this behavior that's pleasurable and reinforced in different ways that gets out of hand because people allow the reward of that activity to drive their choices and drive what they do? Now, people who have a gambling disorder and feel that they miss their family birthday party because they have to go to the casino, they would probably say, I feel completely out of control of this behavior and I feel like I have a mental disorder. But we haven't quite gotten to the point as a field where we're willing to say this is a disease versus a problem of behavior over time that needs to be addressed behaviorally.
I vaguely remember some study from my undergrad where a mouse was rewarded for hitting a lever they got a dose of cocaine or something like that, and the mouse would just sit there and hit the lever all day.
Right.
Because, they get a good response from that.
Yes.
Or their brain does at the very least, even though it causes them to not eat or drink or do other things that they should be doing.
Right. And cocaine is a good example because it directly releases dopamine in the brain, which is that reinforcing chemical that we've evolved as human beings to have, because pleasurable activities like reproducing have allowed our species to survive. And so our bodies want us to be engaging in those things so that we can survive and pass on our genes to subsequent generations. But in this environment where things are so plentiful, we're not really built to handle that. And sometimes those ancient reinforcing mechanisms really make it hard to resist. Another example is when you're driving down the road and you get a text message and you think, oh gosh, I shouldn't look at that. We know it's dangerous to read text while you're driving, but because it's so irresistible, oftentimes people dig in their bag and get their phone out and check that text. It's not the right thing and you might know it, but you sort of do it anyways because that tension, when you don't, is so strong and hard to tolerate.
I've heard smartphones have been put in that category of reinforcing the brain response where you're looking at your smartphone 100, 200 times a day, not because anything's changed, but because it gives your brain a response that's, maybe a little bit of dopamine when you see something
rewarding,
new come up. Yeah.
Oh, the little notifications and, this app, had a new widget come through or, the weather's changing. Let's check it out. Well, you could also look out the window, but all of this is designed to reinforce using these products, and we're very susceptible to that. And we oftentimes need to take steps to prevent things from getting out of hand.
So if it's not a classifiable mental illness in and of itself, could there be some underlying mental illness that makes someone either more susceptible or amplifies the effects of these gratifying behaviors?
Absolutely. That's a really good framework for thinking about these things. Anytime we see people with behaviors that they've had difficulty managing, we will often screen for things like depression or anxiety. So if somebody is very, very depressed and lacks energy, lacks interest, they may be using those little bit of dopamine hits, so to speak, to get them through the day or get them to their next activity, pass time when they're maybe not doing other things that take a lot more effort because of how exhausted they may be. And sometimes treating things like depression can make it much easier for people to implement more skillful or effective behaviors. There's this idea that perhaps people self-medicate with these pleasurable behaviors to treat things like depression.
Now, are there any compulsive type behaviors that are classified in the DSM?
Yeah, so one you already mentioned was drug and alcohol use. So that's a territory where there's really not been any hesitation to say, okay, using drugs and alcohol in a way that's escalating and leading to consequences. The psychiatric community is in full agreement that this does represent a disorder in the addictive category. Interestingly, the other one that's come up is that of hoarding. So people who take their interest or passion or hobby really to dangerous levels of accumulation of objects and things. That has been clearly delineated in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual as a disorder.
Hoarding is fascinating.
And tragic, yeah.
It's so tragic because it's just so easy to see that that person has a huge problem that they can't identify themselves, or that they can, but they still don't want to throw away that old newspaper.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting and challenging aspects of something like hoarding, is that it's different than what I described before from an obsessional disorder, because oftentimes there is insight with an obsessional disorder. People say, I keep having this violent image go into my brain of me stabbing somebody, but I would never do that, and this is so disturbing, and I hate this, and I can't figure out how to make this thought stop. There's a lot of insight there, right? With hoarding, there tends to not be insight. People tend to minimize the nature of the problem, and it's very hard for people in their family or people in the community or even the mental health community to intervene here, because insight tends to be poor when it comes to these severe hoarding disorders. And so that's a challenge, and that's one way hoarding doesn't quite fit in this box, but it has been classified as a compulsion.
What about the Harvey Weinsteins of the world, the Anthony Wieners, the persons who are classified in the media as sexually addicted or sex addiction or things like that? Is that recognized? Is that a real thing?
That's been certainly another hot topic in the news, and this is an area of very intense debate in the medical community. Of course, you have programs that are popping up, residential programs or other treatment programs saying we help people with their sexual addiction. And the concern is that sometimes people will engage in behaviors, sometimes socially unacceptable or criminal or bad behaviors, and would say, well, I have a disorder and I need treatment for this disorder, rather than taking responsibility for the consequences of those actions. And that's why there's some tension there. The other thing is, unlike drugs and alcohol, sexual activity is not necessarily unhealthy in and of itself. And somebody could be engaging in a lot of sexual activity and it wouldn't necessarily be problematic depending on the circumstances and the consensual nature of that activity. And so it's sort of a difficult area. It's similar to eating. Is eating too much a disorder or not?
Is eating too much a disorder?
There are certainly people who have health consequences from the amount of food they eat, and
those people may need help in order to stop eating that much.
Yeah, there are many programs that help work with people on their goals of reducing their body weight or changing their nutritional habits and patterns.
Like, I've heard it classified as binge eating. Is it the same as anorexia? Can it be treated the same way?
Interestingly, there is a disorder called binge eating disorder, but it describes a very specific pattern of behavior. So, for example, this describes people who eat a very large amount of calories, 3,000 or 4,000 calories in one sitting, in a very large amount in a way that feels completely out of control.
Talking about my Thursday night?
Well, potentially. We don't need to get it here on air. But people who feel disgusted after a binge episode, who felt completely powerless over it, but it tends to be episodic in nature. And the DSM has been comfortable classifying this pattern of overeating as a disorder, but it has stopped short of labeling excessive nutritional intake in an ongoing way as mental illness. Will that change in the future? Maybe, as we learn more about the drivers of different behaviors. But right now it's considered problematic and with health consequences, but it's one of those things that would require sort of an individualized treatment plan to work on behavioral change, habit change, versus mental illness treatment per se.
The underlying question then, how far is too far? Like, when is a habit or obsession a compulsion? You touched on it.
Yeah, when does an interest or a passion turn into a disorder?
Yeah. Can I go gambling every weekend?
Or a problem, we'll say it that way.
Yeah.
When does a passion or interest turn into a problem? That's an individual question for each person. In the Star Wars example, if you were missing work because you had to drive to Kansas to get that special collectible, and you ended up being fired from multiple jobs because you were out finding these different characters, that is potentially a problem. It's dysfunctional, but it's sort of up to the individual to define that and seek help for that or not.
And when that dysfunction is identified, what's the treatment if that in and of itself is not a psychiatric disorder?
We have a number of treatments available to work on meaningful behavior change. Whatever the behavior is or whatever the passion, if somebody is starting to have recognition that it's gone to a point beyond that of being healthy because of how it's enacted consequences on other areas of one's life, we can engage in specific treatments like cognitive behavior therapy that we've talked about before. If there's impulsivity or mood states involved in some of those choices, we can assess for certain medication treatments that might be helpful in conjunction with psychotherapy treatments, but it really does come down to an individual plan.
Okay, so I will look into that.
There are also support groups for people who have shared goals. So Gambling Anonymous is one such group, where it's not necessarily a treatment for a mental illness, but it's a group of people who together have this joint goal of gambling less and work together to achieve that.
One of the things that we often hear feedback on is when people have identified a family member who they feel, fits into this category, but they're unsure how to address it with that person. How should a family member talk to or make contact with, someone that they feel may have a compulsion that's affecting their lives, but may not be noticed or have raised concern in the individual yet?
That is such a common concern and a common question, and a delicate one too, because if you have a loved one or a family member with a certain passion that in your mind has had consequences, but in their mind has not, there's really a disconnect there. So if somebody loves swimming so much that they miss all of the family events because they're out swimming or participating in competitive swimming events or learning about swimming or reading about swimming, and you see those consequences racking up whereas they may not, it can be a very difficult conversation. And really, if it gets to a dangerous point, you may be at a point of having what we would call sort of a family intervention, where you sit somebody down and say, hey, we care about you, we love you, we recognize you have this passion or interest, but we're concerned that it's been racking up these consequences, and let me list them for you. But short of anything to that degree, it may be a disconnect in terms of their passions and interests and the degree versus your understanding.
So my wife might be concerned that I've seen Star Wars 10 times and missed my daughter's birthday party, but I might not have a problem with that.
Right. And so what does that conversation look like? What would your wife say? Gosh, we'd like you around more, or something like that. This is often sows the seed of a lot of discord and tension when there's these mismatches. Or you're on a date and your date's got their phone and they're texting and twittering away when you're trying to see if they're your future partner material. I mean, we see this virtually, all the time.
I have a feeling that's how a lot of dates end.
Right. Yeah. Just put off by this failure to manage behavior and to delay that reward of checking your phone. So this is all over the place, and we, as a society, need to start learning how to have these conversations in a productive way and being open to that feedback if you're given that feedback. Hey, that behavior you appear to maybe be crossing a line, or, what can you do to sort of get a handle on this better? I think it would help your job performance, your relationship performance, or those kinds of things. So it's very difficult, and you might want to consult with a mental health professional just to develop an approach or the specific language if you have particular concerns about a person.
Okay. Thank you for joining us today. This podcast was produced by Kaz and George. Music by Paul.
He's the best.
Contact us and send us your questions on Twitter @MindDeconstruct.